My name is Roslyn Prinsley, and I'm the Head of Disaster Solutions in ICEDS. Today, the ANU Climate Update is presenting an overview of how our climate is changing and how we are responding to these changes in Australia and around the world. Those of you who are here for the first session with Professors Mark Howden and Helen Clue will have heard about the increasing and widespread impacts of climate change, why we need to make every effort to adapt and respond, and where we are up to with these responses. This second session will discuss some of the implications of the latest round of UN climate negotiations, COP26, held in Glasgow in November 2021. Presentations will focus on three critical issues. Kate Donnelly will explain why we need 2030 targets for emission reduction. Dr. Melanie Pill will discuss options for addressing climate change-related loss and damage. And Professor Jamie Pittock will provide an 11-point plan for adaptation to climate change in Australia. Please be aware that this event is being recorded and will be made available on the ICEDS YouTube channel tomorrow. Now, I know that there will be many questions, and we're really keen to hear your questions. So if you have a question for the Q&A session, which is after the presentation, please click on the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen at any time and enter your question there. You can also vote for your top questions in the Q&A tab. The most popular questions are likely to be answered during the discussion session. Please do not submit questions in the chat because otherwise they won't be seen. Only submit them in the Q&A tab. The chat function, nevertheless, will remain open so that we can interact with each other in this situation where we cannot be together in person. If the pop-ups from the chat are bothering you, you can go into the settings menu on your Zoom profile and turn these off. Please see the link on how to do this in the chat before you close it down. Before I introduce the first speaker, I would like to remind you about the wonderful Aquifer exhibitions here in Canberra, and you hopefully have been watching them on your screen during the last few minutes. Local and interstate artists and galleries from across Canberra have joined forces to engage in the climate crisis dialogue to coincide with our Climate Update 2022. Artists have an important role in provoking meaningful dialogue around the inherent urgency for us all to act now to preserve the fragility of our environment for future generations. The Aquifer events and exhibitions are definitely worth exploring, and so to find out more information about these and when they're happening, please visit the events page on the ICEDS website or go to the Belconnen Arts website, which the link will be shared in the chat box. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Kate Donnelly. Kate is a corporate engagement analyst with the Investor Group on climate change. She's also studying her Master of Climate Change at ANU. Kate was previously a climate analyst with UniSuper, supporting achievement of net zero carbon emissions across the investment portfolio by 2050. Kate's also the student representative to the Below Zero Initiative Advisory Committee at ANU. Thank you, Kate.
Thanks very much. I will just set up some share screen. Just checking that that's all good. Dr. Prinsley?
Yes, that's wonderful. Thank you.
Great. Hello, everyone. My name's Kate. It's a privilege to be part of today's event. Over the next 15 minutes, we'll be talking about the importance of 2030 emission reduction targets. We're going to start this session with a brief discussion on why the next 8 years are so important for getting climate targets and policies right. We'll then look back at how public and private commitments to climate action have evolved over the past year. We'll finish with a review of the developments we still need to advocate for in Australia to align our emissions pathway with the Paris Agreement. I wanted to start this session with an acknowledgement that we're in the critical decade that will determine the future state of our climate. We're going to explore three key points here: that emissions are rising, that we still have a choice about what happens next, and that an increasing number of global actors are committing to a 1.5 degree target. Professor Howden explained in the last session that emissions have been rising steadily over the past 30 years throughout the history of climate negotiations and agreements. The other point I want you to take from this graph is that global pressure to address climate change has increased significantly too. Where it took 10 years for the Kyoto Protocol, which was the first international agreement to try to reduce global emissions, to gain enough signatures to become legally binding, it took only a year for the Paris Agreement to reach that same milestone. However, even with this growing pressure and the renewed commitment enshrined in the Paris Agreement, the fact remains that emissions are still rising and we're running out of time to set ourselves on an orderly transition pathway. It's worth asking what an orderly transition pathway is. The Network for Greening the Financial System defines an orderly transition pathway as one in which climate policies are introduced early and become more stringent over time. The early start enables a more ambitious temperature target to be pursued and gives everyone enough time to plan, therefore minimizing physical and transition risks. In contrast, a disorderly pathway is characterized by high physical and transition risks due to delayed or poorly coordinated climate policies. A hothouse world is one in which climate policies are insufficient to stop significant temperature rise, leading to severe and irreversible physical impacts. We have a closing window of opportunity to choose which temperature target, timeline, and strategies, collectively which scenario we pursue. This choice is what makes this decade so important. I've pulled out two graphs from the IPCC's first paper in the 6th Assessment Report series, which was published in August last year, to help illustrate this point. The graph on the left shows 5 illustrative emissions pathways adopted by the IPCC in their modelling. These range from the bottom light blue line, representing immediate, rapid, and sustained cuts to emissions, and the top red line, where global emissions rise exponentially. The graph on the right shows the temperature response modelled for each of the emissions pathways. Only the bottom two would align with the Paris Agreement, though there's nuance in that point that we'll turn to in the next slide. Last year's IPCC report also confirmed that global average temperatures have already increased by 1.1 degrees since the Industrial Revolution, and that we're more likely than not to surpass 1.5 degrees of warming by 2040, a decade earlier than previously thought. The long response times of our climate system mean that temperatures will continue to rise until at least mid-century as a result of emissions already in the atmosphere. Whether temperatures continue to rise or stabilize and decline after that point depends on how quickly and aggressively we begin to reduce our emissions today. The cost and disruptiveness of the global energy transition, given the enormity of the challenge, are reliant on the same decisions. The final point to make in this section is that the 2 degree and 1.5 degree targets in the Paris Agreement are not equally acceptable outcomes. There's a big difference between a world that's 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees hotter, which was confirmed in the special report on the topic published by the IPCC in 2018. That report found that 2 degrees of warming would result in much more extreme physical and socioeconomic impacts, and that those impacts would be intolerable for exposed frontline communities. The report also found that global emissions would need to decline by at least 45% by 2030 on 2010 levels and reach net zero by 2050 to have an even chance of achieving the 1.5 degree target. The good news is that after years of advocacy and organising by Indigenous, frontline and scientific communities, we're seeing the movement to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees transform from a politically remote possibility to a global force. Over 140 countries have made net zero commitments alongside hundreds of companies and other institutions. The Glasgow Climate Pact, adopted at COP26 last November, is another powerful example of this progress. The pact reaffirms the global political commitment to 1.5 and for the first time recognised the IPCC's call to effectively halve global CO2 emissions by 2030. Right, so the science is clear and a growing number of governments, companies and other institutions are converging around a 1.5 degree target. We're now going to have a look at what new mitigation initiatives and commitments were made last year and consider the implementation gap that we still need to bridge. 2021 was a big year for both public and private efforts to mobilise ambitious climate action. The first set of developments I want to highlight relate to new global resources and initiatives intended to catalyse net zero commitments and stronger 2030 targets. This includes the launch of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, or GFANZ, which calls on financial institutions, including banks, investors and insurers, to reduce direct and financed emissions to zero by 2050, underpinned by robust 2030 targets and transparent reporting. The initiative has significant influence with over 450 members across 45 countries representing more than US $130 trillion. In May, the IEA released its first net zero by 2050 roadmap for the global energy system. One of the most significant and controversial recommendations was that no new coal mines or oil and gas fields would be needed after 2021 in this scenario. Less than 2 weeks later, a Dutch court ordered oil major Shell to reduce their total emissions by 45% by 2030 in order to meet its duty of care under Dutch and international human rights law. While the ruling is being challenged by Shell, it represents a new and serious threat to corporate inaction on climate change. The final development to highlight is the release of the first report in the IPCC's long-awaited sixth assessment report, the first findings of which Professor Howden spoke about last session. A number of significant commitments by some of the world's biggest emitters were also announced last year. In April, the US announced a new 2030 target to reduce national emissions by 50 to 52%. The EU announced the details of its Fit for 55 package, which will underpin its commitment to reduce the bloc's emissions by 55% by 2030 and to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. China committed to peak emissions before 2030 and update to its target to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. While that target is a decade too late to limit warming to 1.5, China's announcement of a partnership with the US to reduce transport, energy, and industrial emissions this decade may enable greater ambition. COP26 last November was a key forum for new and tangible global mitigation commitments in support of the 1.5 degree target. Professor Howden covered many of these updates in the previous session, key among which were the agreement to submit stronger 2030 targets by COP27 and to revise those targets on an annual basis thereafter, and an historic call to accelerate the phase down of unabated coal power and phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. While this call for a phase down was underwhelming for many, it is complemented by momentum around the Powering Past Coal Alliance. Nearly 50 nations have joined the alliance so far, which calls for a total phase out of coal power by 2030 in the OECD and EU, and mid-century in the rest of the world. This phase out is essential, but it's also costly for low and middle income countries. It was therefore positive to hear the South African government announce a first of its kind concessional finance package worth US 8.5 billion, sourced from a number of OECD nations, designed to support an earlier and just transition away from coal-fired power. Despite these positive developments, there remains a significant ambition and implementation gap. The UNFCCC publishes a synthesis report of all countries' climate commitments, known as Nationally Determined Contributions or NDCs. The graph on this slide is taken from the synthesis report that was published just before COP26, showing the significant gap between our policy rhetoric and reality. The report concluded that current climate policies would result in a catastrophic 2.7 degrees of warming by the end of the century. Updated analysis conducted post-COP26 suggests that commitments made during the conference, if implemented in full, could limit warming to anywhere between 1.9 to 2.4 degrees. The fact that that range is still beyond the 1.5 degree limit and is reliant on many conditional commitments highlights the magnitude of the challenge still ahead. In our final 5 minutes, I want to focus on the state of play in Australia. The two main points that we'll explore are that our national targets could easily be more ambitious and that several roadmaps to guide our energy transition already exist. So let's start with the national landscape. Days before COP26, the federal government announced a commitment to reach net zero emissions by 2050. This development is significant in large part because it signals a critical breakaway from the toxic politics that have derailed effective climate policy for decades. It's also important to acknowledge that the net zero commitment was announced without new interim targets or supporting policies, backed by a plan that relies heavily on future breakthroughs for a range of low carbon technologies and carbon sequestration methods that are still under development. While investment in technical solutions for hard to abate sectors, including carbon capture and storage and zero emissions hydrogen, should be a part of a robust net zero plan, the absence of tangible near and medium term emission reduction strategies, which could be achieved at relatively low cost with proven technology and policies, is a serious flaw in the federal plan. As it stands, the current federal 2030 target of a 26 to 28% reduction is aligned with at least 2 degrees of warming. What's interesting though is that state and territory targets alone will result in greater cuts. Specifically, analysis published by Climate Analytics last October suggests that we're actually on track to reduce national emissions by 30 to 42%, depending on targets yet to be set by Western Australia and the Northern Territory, as a result of state and territory-led renewable energy projects, electric vehicle policies, and land management practices. The Climate Analytics report was also one of 3 major reports released over the past 2 years that proposed policy pathways capable of cutting emissions by 45 to 60% by 2030, bringing the ambition of Australian climate policy in line with the Paris Agreement. ClimateWorks Australia and the Grattan Institute have also released pathways. And while we don't have time to explore each in detail, I did want to highlight some of the common high-impact proposals before we close this session. The first is to incentivise faster uptake of available technologies and solutions, including large-scale renewables and storage that include transmission upgrades to enable future expansion of the grid as other sectors begin to electrify. Electrification and energy efficiency upgrades to residential and commercial buildings, constructing charging infrastructure for electric vehicles and implementing tax or other incentives to increase uptake, supporting industry research and development to increase material and fuel substitution, including through electrification and zero emissions hydrogen. And finally, supporting farmers to restore degraded land, adopt alternative livestock feeds, and develop and commercialize carbon sequestration. Overall, I think we can view 2021 as a turning point for global mitigation efforts. We need to recognise that accumulated emissions have already resulted in terrible impacts that will continue to worsen unless we rapidly close the gap between climate commitments and actions. Our window to secure an orderly transition is closing, and while we can celebrate the turning tide of public and private commitments to reach net zero by 2050, we need to turn our attention to 2030 targets that will drive immediate investment in the proven and available technologies and policies that can reduce emissions across every sector this decade. It's critical that we go all in. Thank you for your time. I'll hand back to Dr. Prinsley.
Sorry, I'm having a bit of technical. Can you hear me?
I can.
Technical issues here. I don't seem to be able to start the video, but thank you very much, Kate, and thank you very much for your call to action as well, which I think is very, very important and highly apt. So I'm sure that there'll be many questions. Oh, hang on, start my video. Sorry. I'm sure there'll be many questions. So if you do have questions for Kate or for anyone else on the panel after Kate, please remember to put them into the Q&A tab. So I would like now to introduce our next speaker, who's Dr. Melanie Pill from the ANU Fenner School of Environment and Society. Melanie has recently finished her PhD, congratulations Melanie, and has been also working for various government environment departments on policies and strategies, climate change, adaptation and mitigation, renewable energy and energy efficiency. Melanie's PhD at the Fenner School of Environment and Society looked at financing loss and damage from climate change in small island developing nations. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say, Melanie. Thank you.
Thank you, Roslyn. And I'm going to try now also without any technical hiccups to share my screen. So let's see whether that's going to work, and let me know whether that's visible for everyone.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Melanie. I can see your screen.
Wonderful. Now I just need to get up my speaker notes, and there they are. Great. Well, good afternoon or almost good evening, everyone. And thank you, Kate, for this excellent presentation. It's actually a good segue into my topic, which shows what will happen if we don't ramp up our ambition. So today I'll be talking to you about climate change, loss and damage, and the impacts it has all around the globe. So I have to say that it was not an easy task to put a presentation together for such a large and diverse audience, to make it engaging for everyone, and it presented itself as quite challenging. So in order to get us all on the same page, because loss and damage is still such a mystery to many, I'd like to give you a two-minute crash course on what it is and how it emerged, before giving an update on current developments in the climate change negotiations and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And then I will finish with what I believe could be a way forward and Australia's potential role in the near-term future. In the end, if there's time, I'll give you a little bit of an insight of my own research as well. So what do we mean by loss and damage? Firstly, it is a concept under the UNFCCC and recognized as loss and damage that is caused by the impacts of climate change and which are now unavoidable. And in fact, they're getting worse with every year. So it has been important to developing countries since the inception of the Climate Change Convention, as back then we already knew that these impacts will occur at one point in the future. and that developing countries will be the ones suffering the consequences disproportionately of actions that they hadn't done, or because of actions that they hadn't done. And so this leads us to the element of fault that losses and damages from climate change entail. Because there's a clear correlation between emitted greenhouse gases from major polluters and climate change, and hence loss and damage, the issue is contentious, politicized, and sensitive, which has made it really hard to talk about and agree upon in negotiations. So as mentioned earlier, loss and damage was already spoken about at the very beginning of the establishment of the UNFCCC in 1991. But its inclusion, or its formal inclusion in the convention, was opposed to by developed countries due to the very reasons of fears of culpability, accountability, and fault. Some progress was made over the years, but it then culminated in the establishment of the so-called Warsaw International Mechanism of Loss and Damage and its executive committee that was tasked to enhance knowledge and understanding on loss and damage. And that's really just in a nutshell. Then a major breakthrough was made in 2015 when parties agreed on the Paris Agreement. And a lot of you might have heard about the Paris Agreement in 2015, and it was a major milestone for many other things as well. But loss and damage was finally formally recognized under Article 8, and it received a separate mention from mitigation and adaptation. Different was, however, that any funding or compensation for any type of loss and damage was explicitly excluded. And this is where we are now. With a separate mention of loss and damage in the Paris Agreement, it also received its separate paragraph in the Katowice climate package. So that is the rule book that outlines how to achieve our Paris pledges and has hence also been carried over into the Glasgow Climate Pact that we have already talked about earlier, and which was negotiated last year. So that was a bit of a history lesson here. And under the UNFCCC, we distinguish between different types of loss and damage. Firstly, we have extreme weather events and slow onset events. Extreme weather events can be floods and hurricanes. We've seen already devastating pictures from Mark, but also droughts, which we sometimes might not think of. And these events are getting more and more frequent and severe. For example, in the Pacific, for the last, since 2014, there was a Category 5 hurricane every single year, apart from 2019. And some of the islands were actually hit multiple times in a row. In the Caribbean, the 2020 hurricane season has been the most active on record, with unprecedented number of hurricanes. And because of those events, people lose their livelihoods, and rehabilitation takes years, and so does the recovery of the economy. One figure that was estimated, and there are a lot floating around by the UN, are around $300 billion per year by 2030 to pay for all the losses and damages caused by climate change. Others believe this number to be way higher. And then there are slow onset events. The most known probably sea level rise, but also salinization of the soil or desertification. And as a result, areas become uninhabitable. Crops are impossible to grow because of salt in the soil. Land is permanently inundated by the seawater and does not recede anymore. For many communities around the globe, this poses an existential threat, and living safely becomes increasingly hard for some people on the planet. Other types of loss and damage are human migration and so-called non-economic losses. People have increasingly been moving due to extreme and slow onset events that I have just described. This might be temporary or permanently when it's existential. Planned relocation has become a reality, and countries prepare for internal displacement. Fiji, for example, were the first to develop planned relocation guidelines, And the executive committee of the WIM established a task force that published recommendations on how to address displacement. Australia played a big role in that, by the way, also served on the WIM since its inception in 2013. And extreme weather, sea level rise, and migration don't just cause economic and monetary hardship, but also so-called non-economic losses. These relate to one's culture, personal belongings, and what defines our identity or where we come from. My research in the Caribbean has shown that they are even more complex than that and relate to things that provide your life meaning, purpose, and security. So impacts are also political instability, crime, mental health, or what seems to be simple things like lost education or lost job opportunities. And the estimates for loss and damage finance that I mentioned earlier does not even cover these types of impacts. And the question is whether we actually can cover these impacts. So now, where are we currently under the UNFCCC in terms of addressing loss and damage? Well, I guess you've noticed by now, the progress is slow. In Katowice in 2019, loss and damage received its standalone paragraph under the transparency framework, like I mentioned, now reporting on past, present, and future loss and damage, again, independent from adaptation and mitigation as possible, which will give us an important distinction and hopefully or demonstrate the magnitude of the issue if countries decide to report on it. COP25 in Madrid saw the launch of the so-called Santiago Network for Loss and Damage, which aims to provide technical assistance to developing countries and connect communities and organizations that share their experiences and lessons learned from action on loss and damage. And then the recent Glasgow Climate Pact agreed on functions and the process for the Santiago Network, but does not outline any institutional arrangements. We agreed, or countries agreed, on a dialogue on loss and damage finance in the next round of negotiations. And there was funding brought forward for a small number of staff provided by Germany, not the staff, the funding, of about $11.5 million. However, important to say that these are not dedicated funds to address loss and damage. There's a clear push from developing countries for scaled up and additional finance. And in Glasgow, the need for a funding facility for loss and damage was also brought up. Some countries even made reference to compensation claims through other legal means if no finance is identified. So while separate funds for loss and damage were still not agreed on, there is increasing recognition amongst all parties, developed and developing countries, that loss and damage is occurring and that urgent action is required. And the fact that loss and damage is mentioned 12 times in the Glasgow Climate Pact might give evidence for that. So what's next? Well, looking ahead to the intersessional negotiations in Bonn mid-year and COP27 at the end of 2022, the exact role of the Santiago Network will be clarified and agreed upon, but there are many questions. So what will action under this network look like? What form will it take? What are the institutional arrangements? Will loss and damage continue to sit under the umbrella of adaptation? How are funds being dispersed if they're made available? What does it mean to fund the network, and who will run the network? Well, there might be probably many other questions that will come up then, but clear is that finance for action and support and addressing loss and damage will undoubtedly be on the negotiation table. And we can expect to see that developing countries will fight hard for financial assistance. So what is or what can be Australia's role, opportunity and responsibility be in all of this? In the longer term and on an international level, there has to be contribution and willingness to act, also financially, to remain a credible party to the convention. In the short term and as an immediate action, Australia should continue to foster a strong relationship with our Pacific neighbours. As the on-the-ground impacts are very much local, Australia has a responsibility to provide targeted assistance and in the longer term also identify meaningful migration pathways and that go beyond what is currently in place. Also exploring options to address loss and damage, which could possibly be through existing arrangements. This knowledge could be shared internationally with all parties to the convention, which will help to set a positive global example for action on loss and damage. So just quickly going to some of my research insights, and although it all seems a bit doomy and gloomy, my research also has shown that there are avenues we can pursue that countries actually do agree on. So firstly, there is high consensus that we shouldn't let loss and damage happen in the first place, and that adaptation approaches, as well as emission reductions, are absolutely crucial. But we also know that it's too late for some of the loss and damage to happen or to be prevented, as outlined in the previous presentations. Secondly, compensation is not something that is necessarily desired by everyone. This was based on local research in country with individuals that are on the ground, as well as loss and damage practitioners across the globe that negotiate on an international level. So policymakers or academics and loss and damage practitioners. It is not considered a practical solution as it has so many legal implications and requirements. Thirdly, the role of the Green Climate Fund could be looked at in terms of an inclusion of loss and damage. Existing architectures that could be modified, such as the European Union Solidarity Fund, but also the Central Emergency Response Fund of the UN could be explored as part of that and made use of. Lastly, innovative sources of finance are required. I explored how philanthropic organizations can be engaged and provide financial flows into a funding facility, whatever it might look like in the future. We know, agree, and acknowledge that loss and damage is occurring, and Mark's figures have shown that we, even in the developed world, but particularly developing countries, are running out of time. So I think, and from what I've experienced and heard from people working on loss and damage, we need to make use of what's currently in place and expand on it, be pragmatic, and apply practical approaches to address loss and damage, because for some, it is already too late. Thank you. And there are some publications and resources if you want to have a look at what has been coming out of my PhD and what I've worked on previously. So yeah, thanks everyone for listening. Oh, okay, I was just wondering. I think you're still muted, Roslyn.
Oh, so I've been talking and no one heard a word I said. That's
okay.
Okay, so what I was doing was thanking you, Melanie, for that insightful presentation, and also suggesting that many people would be very interested to read your PhD thesis and the papers arising from it, as it's so relevant to this whole issue of loss and damage. It did surprise me that some of these small island states weren't interested in receiving loss and damage until I heard some of the rationale. So I think looking into that further is really important. So thank you very much. Yeah. I'm sure there are a lot of questions already on the Q&A for you, so you should go and have a look at them. Yes. So thank you very much.
It happens. It happens.
Yeah, okay. So so I'd now like to introduce Jamie Pittock. He's a professor from the ANU Fenner School for Environment and Society and also supervised Melanie's PhD. Jamie also convenes the ANU Masters of Climate Change program, and his research focuses on environmental governance, climate change adaptation, energy and sustainable management of water, prior to joining ANU, Jamie worked for the World Wildlife Fund International as the director of their Global Freshwater Program. Jamie is also a member of the Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists, of the World Commission on Protection Areas, and serves on the advisory board of the Nature Conservancy Australia and the Public Fund of Water Stewardship Asia Pacific. And he also chairs the Eminent Scientists Groups of World Wildlife Fund of Australia. Thank you, Jamie.
Roslyn, thank you.
So I can see your presentation. Thank you, Jamie.
Fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, I get to discuss with you the third pillar of our climate change response, that concerning climate change adaptation. And I'm going to be a little bit more domestically focused in this presentation compared to those that have preceded me by talking about what an excellent national adaptation approach might look like. Now, ladies and gentlemen, no doubt you recall that the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change actually obliges countries to formulate, implement and publish and regularly update national and, where appropriate, regional programs to do, among other things, measures to facilitate adequate adaptation to climate change. And the national governments are also committing to take climate change considerations into account to the extent feasible in their relevant social, economic and environmental policies and actions. And so it's in that context that I'd like to talk about Australia's National Climate Resilience and Adaptation Strategy that was adopted in late 2021 and how that could be enhanced. There's been a long-running debate in countries with a federal system of government, particularly Australia's, about what is the national government's role for adaptation, given that adaptation actions have to be locally contextual, that the adaptation practiced, for example, to manage floods in Queanbeyan is going to be much more significant in a relatively unplanned city like Queanbeyan compared to that in Canberra, for instance. And so a number of senior thought leaders in the federal government in the past have said, well, the national government role is relatively limited. In the National Climate Resilience and Adaptation Strategy, the federal government has decided last year that the role of the federal government is to provide national science and information, to manage adaptation for Commonwealth assets and programs, which strangely they don't actually talk about at all very much in their strategy. To provide leadership on national adaptation reform, which is covered most rhetorically in the strategy. And it goes on to talk about maintaining a strong economy and so forth. ANU prepared a submission in the development of this strategy, which is on the ICED's website. And we argued that the federal government has overlooked a crucial role that it holds, which is facilitating the resources needed to support adaptation measures, particularly financing, at subnational scales through national agreements, direct grants, co-funding and other instruments. NCRAS, if I can use that dreadful acronym, was adopted last year with 3 objectives. And you can see these objectives here. The first one about driving investment and action through collaboration. There's very little substance in the strategy. The second one about providing improved climate information and services. I must confess to being a little bit cynical because it seems that in Australia, and we've seen this over several decades, that when a federal government is struggling to identify what to do with adaptation, they revert to funding more climate change modelling. I and my ANU colleagues have argued that climate change adaptation is not inhibited by the lack of new or robust climate data. Federal governments in recent years have funded substantial information on climate change impacts in sectors like water availability, floodplain management, coastal lands at risk, fire-prone lands and natural resources management. We would argue that there are diminishing returns from further investing in this sort of modelling because of the uncertainty as to the precise magnitude and rates of impacts of climate change, and because there are so many practical things that we need to do now and can do now, we'd really argue that it's time for federal government action. So what we have put to the federal government is that they have a remarkable opportunity. We've proposed an 11-point plan of practical things a federal government can do. And the first is to actually look through the plethora of existing adaptation plans in key sectors by state governments and at the regional scale, such as those shown here, look to see what they are proposing to do and find ways of supporting them to do it better and faster, particularly through funding. The second point we've proposed with this 11-point plan is the concept of betterment. So until recently in Australia, when stuff has been destroyed by extreme events, bridges washed away, for example, the funding has been to build it back as was. What's really needed are programs such as Queensland betterment programs to support the departments, the local governments, other people in society to plan what a stronger or better piece of infrastructure or response would be, so that when it is destroyed in a cyclone or a flood, for instance, it can be built back quickly to a much better standard. A real winner would be for Australia to adopt better building standards. There are many examples around Australia of the kinds of building standards that could be adopted, such as the passive house principles. These would be a win-win solution in many respects, such as reducing energy consumption, such as being better able to keep people cool in heat waves, to withstand things like fires and so forth. Better building standards are a key. And what's notable about this is many of these measures are about higher standards and not greatly increased federal government expenditure. Another key measure we're proposing is stronger standards around coastal development. We know sea level is rising. The federal government has funded Geosciences Australia to do some excellent mapping of the places at most risk. Now is the time for the federal government to join with the states to come up with a national approach on how to deal with this and how to finance managed retreat where that's needed. The fifth point in our 11-point plan is about relocating people out of harm's way with things like buyback schemes. Sadly, many places where people live are highly vulnerable to things like storm surges, flooding, severe fires. We have a long history in Australia of relocating people out of harm's way. And one more recent case is the town of Grantham, pictured here, where the local government, after the town's destruction in the 2011 flood, made the very sensible decision to redevelop the town on higher ground nearby, to do a land swap and to permanently protect the residents from such repeat destruction. It's really time for our federal and state governments to do this on a much more regular and grander scale. I'm particularly obsessed with water management and adaptation. Around the world, in countries of Europe, the United States, China, governments have stopped trying to fight rivers by building more levee banks and instead have adopted programs to give rivers room to flood safely. And this is a prominent example in the city of Nijmegen in the Netherlands, where the area in blue is a paleo river channel that has been restored to create a safer bypass for floodwaters through the city and providing a much safer opportunity to adapt to this sort of measure. Our seventh point really picks up from all of the lessons that should have been learnt from the severe fire seasons 2 years ago, which is to work with local communities, particularly Indigenous communities, and greatly enhance our management of fire. This is an example in central Canberra, a place I spent a lot of time. This is a nationally significant piece of bushland that should be patch burnt, but the federal government agency who owns the land doesn't have the money to do that fire management. They rely on rural fire service volunteers. It can only be burnt in autumn. There's a plague of public holidays on long weekends in autumn, and so the numbers of days that you can actually do the burning is really, really limited. So why as a society aren't we funding programs to enhance the fire management services, to work with Indigenous communities and have professional patch burning on a more regular basis? Australia has a long and proud history of natural resources management, and our eighth point is about enhancing and reinvigorating natural resources management across our landscapes, to reconnect habitat for adaptation, to do things like plant trees along riverbanks that have many adaptation benefits, and of course contribute to mitigation by sequestering carbon in the landscape. Our ninth point is about working with the agricultural sector to look at the sorts of transformative moves needed to ensure that we retain vibrant rural communities. There's a lot of incremental adaptation underway in the agricultural sector. Australian farmers are masters of it, but sadly, some kinds of crops will not survive new climates, and we need to find new ways of producing good things in rural communities. And this is one example where the Brown Brothers company has recognised that their northeast Victorian location is getting rather hot. So they have transformed their business by purchasing some vineyards in Tasmania to continue growing cool climate wines. Mark earlier talked about the vulnerability that so many Australian communities have to climate-enhanced impacts knocking out power supplies. In Australia, we know how to build renewable energy systems in regional areas, to diversify power systems, to make them more networked and resilient. And we can be doing this at a much bigger scale. And while I've talked about the federal government's reverting to climate modelling and information dissemination, rather than funding the sorts of on-ground changes that are now needed, there is a need for some sort of information coordination to benchmark good practices, share good case studies. Now, the federal government did fund a national climate change adaptation research facility from 2008, but cut the funding from 2019. We need a new kind of information coordination organisation to support the many organisations across Australia who want to do good things. So what I've presented here is a summary of ANU Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions submission, which is on the website. So let me summarise and conclude by saying Australia can and should do much better in organising our national adaptation response than the National Climate Resilience and Adaptation Strategy. In my view, there are limited returns from yet more climate modelling. We know what to do in key sectors to reduce the impacts of climate change. Now is the time for the federal government to join with state and local governments and get on with making happen the kinds of measures that I've just outlined. Thank you, and with that, I will hand back to Roslyn.
Can you hear me? Oh, there we go. Thank you very much, Jamie. That was very insightful and challenging as well. And so thank you very much. And I can see all sorts of comments on saying very informative and very concise. And I think I agree. So thank you. I'd now like to move on to the Q&A session. We do have quite a few questions already. Please feel free to keep adding your questions and also voting on the questions. They're questions for the whole panel. Panel, if it's specifically for you, I'll let you know, but otherwise it's for the whole panel. And I guess there are some points of clarification that I'd quickly like to just get answered quite quickly. One of them is from Will Howard, which is how much does the loss and damage framework depend on attribution to climate change? And I guess, Melanie, if you wouldn't mind responding to that one. It's quite a few people want to know the answer to that question. It should be quite quick.
Thanks, Roslyn, and thanks, Will, for the question. Maybe not as simple as we would like it to be. So definitely a question that comes up a lot. The attribution of certain events or extreme weather events to climate change and how we account for that. So yeah, it is a real issue. There is science out there that is able to calculate the amount of loss and damage, or the likelihood of an event happening because of climate change. It is not necessarily accurate because we don't have all the data that we would need in order to make accurate predictions and calculations. So at the moment, the question of attribution is still out there, and that's one thing that is coming up, that we cannot say that every hurricane and every flood is definitely 100% caused by climate change. What we do know, though, is, and Mark has shown that in his presentation, and Kate has also shown it in her presentation, that events are being more severe, more likely from climate change. So in my research, for example, I asked the question, do we actually need to calculate exactly how much is attributable to climate change? So very good question. It comes up a lot, and yeah, it's also discussed in negotiations. So I hope that sort of answers it a little bit. Will, let me know.
Thank you very much. A question which also many people want to know the answer to is from Michelle Smith. And Michelle has asked, would a global levy on fossil fuels be a good way to raise funds for addressing loss and damage? And perhaps, Melanie, if we could start with you, but perhaps Kate and Jamie might like to respond to this.
Yeah, so I think a levy in general to raise funds for climate change is probably a good idea. It would be, or would create a very continuous and reliable funding stream. COP26 did discuss on carbon markets. It's Article 6, not my area of expertise. You would have to read through the paragraphs exactly what was discussed there. But we are getting to levies in carbon markets and prices on fossil fuels, on greenhouse gas emissions. Again, Mark talked about that at length as well. And yes, it would definitely help to raise funds for loss and damage. Some are also arguing, though, why we shouldn't use these kinds of funds first for more mitigation action and adaptation before we actually use it for loss and damage. We do know, though, like I said, that loss and damage is unavoidable, and that would definitely help if we wanted to, or if countries agree, parties agree to have a little bit of that dedicated to loss and damage. So market mechanisms do definitely work in order to raise and mobilize funds.
And with that challenging question as to why we wouldn't allocate those funds to mitigation, perhaps we can ask Kate to comment as well. Thanks, Kate.
Sorry, could you just repeat that one for me?
Oh, that was like, well, perhaps we could have, it would be a good idea to have a levy on fossil fuels to fund loss and damage. But as Melanie said, there are also queries about whether we shouldn't use those funds for mitigation rather than loss and damage. So is that a good idea to have a levy on fossil fuels to fund mitigation?
It's a good point. And I think the first thing to keep in mind is it shouldn't be an either or situation. We need to fund all of these things, and there's definitely enough resources around the world to fund it. I think that for me goes to the point around a levy or not. I think we know that, for example, capital markets operate in a certain way and public systems work in another way, and they're better suited to addressing different issues. So, I think the idea of a levy brings in both and goes, we know that private markets are essential for life as we know it, as are functioning public systems, and they should be working together. And I think a mechanism like a carbon price or a levy helps bring everyone into the room and plays the roles the best that they can. Hopefully that makes sense.
Thank you. And Jamie, would you like as well to comment on that question?
Yes, I'm going to respond in a politician's manner and change the question, which is, it would be great if rather than a global levy, we also had our governments free up the capacity for state and local governments to do the financing needed for adaptation. So, for example, in nearly all Australian states, local government rates are capped and the state governments prevent local governments from increasing taxes to pay for adaptation. Many of the utilities in Australia go through pricing and regulatory tribunals that rule out the ability of those utilities to pay for things like, for example, making electricity systems more resilient in certain ways due to climate change. And so there's a lot of work for our federal and state governments to do to free up the different parts of society to raise the money needed to do the adaptation job.
So Jamie, while we have you on the screen, what do you think of this is a question from Gregor. What do you think are the most challenging and high priority issues to be addressed with regards to adaptation to climate change? Perhaps you could choose two.
It's a difficult question because I think adaptation is harder than mitigation because adaptation involves all sectors of society and adaptation measures are sectorally and locally contextual. So there's no cookie cutter solution. So Gregor, I'd say one is the financing to enable the many good governments and organisations in our country to get on with the job. If I had to pick one of those that I've listed, I would have said improved building standards could have such a good contribution to making our urban areas, our towns, our homes much more resilient and both help with mitigation and adaptation.
Thank you very much, Jamie. The current top question is for Dr. Pill, and it says, most of the frameworks, agreements and documentation talk about loss and damage as it pertains to humans, infrastructure and settlements. Oh, and this question is from Mel Gore. Is there any push to develop language and agreements surrounding loss and damage as it relates to the environment and non-human related ecosystems? Invariably, everything I've read, this is Mel's read, traces back to linking loss and damage to economics and human benefit, rather than things like biodiversity, ecosystem survival, and the environment for their own sake. Good question. Many people would like to know the answer to this. We'll start with Melanie and then perhaps move on to Jamie and Kate.
Wonderful. What a great question. Thank you so much. And it's definitely not an easy one to answer, and probably goes also into the adaptation arena area as well. So Jamie can add to that later. And I do, admit that a lot of the loss and damage language is around humans and how we continue our survival on this planet, and how we recover from losses and damages. And the GDP loss is often that what's in the foreground, and rehabilitation in countries as well, because these are the first things that we see. But there is also recognition that we need to conserve biodiversity. So, for example, biodiversity loss is actually one type of loss and damage identified by the UNFCCC. So that is included, but not as prominent as the human needs, I would say. It also counts as a non-economic loss. So that is identified there as well, loss of species. So there are considerations for biodiversity. It's not completely left out, but I think in terms of finance, there is always a focus on human well-being. So really good question. And also there is, I guess, if you have funds for loss and damage, you could, in certain contexts, like Jamie said, adaptation is very contextual and localized, invest funds into ecosystem services or other adaptation measures that would reduce the loss and damage that is caused. And avert and minimize is actually also one of the wordings that's used in the Paris Agreement and all the other agreements that we had over the last years, that actually avert and minimize is actually also the language used there. So there is room to include biodiversity loss and looking at also fauna and flora, but the focus is on human beings, I think. So Jamie, do you want to maybe go from here in terms of adaptation?
Certainly, there are so many adaptation measures that we could be undertaking in the natural resource management field that would provide so many wins for society in terms of conserving biodiversity, sequestering carbon, enhancing adaptation, and so forth. As somebody about conservation of freshwater ecosystems, I would argue that rivers and lakes should be a focus for this effort. And I think it's really sad that in the past decade and a half, so much of our natural resources management programs have been defunded. There are great opportunities to fire them up. I am really disappointed at the moment in the way the Murray-Darling Basin is being managed, which to some degree is denial about the impacts of climate change and the need for transformative adaptation. So we've got a basin plan that was adopted in 2012 on the basis that 100% of the historical water availability would continue into the future. And yet in December before last, the authority has said, well, actually in the last 20 years, there's been a 39% fall in river inflows. So we've got a magic pudding basin plan that pretends that we can do everything. We can conserve all ecosystems and continue all the farming. As a society, we need to find some ways to make tougher decisions, triage decisions about, for example, which bits of the natural environment we can sustain, what new novel ecosystems we might support, and similarly in the agricultural space, so that we get the best benefits we can in a bad situation.
Thanks, Jamie. While we have you on the screen again, there is a question from Milton Woods, specifically for you. And Milton has asked, is there really a need to choose between modelling and adaptation? Would the funds dedicated to modelling make a significant difference to adaptation, or do we simply need much more funding for climate action in Australia?
Well, yes, we do need more funding for climate action. I fear that downscaled climate modelling, and I speak as somebody whose father is a climate modeller, it has become a crutch that governments fall on when they can't make more intelligent decisions. And the fact is that the modelling has limits in terms of its utility. So in the case of the Murray Basin, CSIRO's modelling says there could be anything from 7% more water by 2030 to around 27% less water. Now, how do you get to a better state of governance by doing more and more modelling around that span of potential outcomes? So that's why I would argue that the time is here for society to look at what kinds of adaptation measures will provide benefits under a range of different climate impacts and outcomes, rather than pretending that we can model our way to some precision as to what to adapt to. I see in the chat line one of the participants has said, well, we need modelling, especially extreme events rather than averages. Well, sure, but we in Australia already suffered from some of the most extreme events, as we saw the summer before last. We know what the extreme events are. There's so much we could be doing now to adapt to those sorts of extreme events that we're not doing. I'm not sure that more modelling is going to get us there any faster.
Thanks very much, Jamie. I'm now going to change tack and ask Kate to answer a question that's been rated highly, a question from Anna-Greta Hunter. And Anna-Greta has said, the ACT leads in many of our climate policies, particularly use of renewable energy, yet our per capita carbon footprint was second highest in Australia because of our Scope 3 emissions. Should we address our total carbon footprint, and how?
Excellent question. I also just wanted to add a quick note on a couple of questions back around the loss and damage and kind of the biodiversity ecosystem angle, just by kind of calling out that Indigenous communities globally are custodians of much of the remaining biodiversity we have on the planet, and that I think loss and damage reparations should really be acknowledging that as well, that this is both a human and then intrinsically ecological issue, and that there are communities globally who have been doing this work for kind of time immemorial and will continue to do so.
Thanks very much, Kate.
Yeah, so in terms of Scope 3, it's really, my kind of familiarity with it is more around kind of the corporate discussion. I'm not so familiar with the ACT specific context, but I think there may be some translatable kind of points, I suppose. And the first is that everyone is keen to say Scope 3 is someone else's problem, which, you know, it kind of feels like a technicality, right? We're also interconnected. It's really hard to draw the boundary. So of course, I think a holistic approach to climate mitigation should include all scopes, because in reality, you may not be directly responsible, but you do have a lot of influence, and particularly for governments or very large companies who have a lot of say over their value chains. I think there's an even higher responsibility then to be actively engaging the folks along those chains. I just saw a question in the chat around what is Scope 3, and it's also a very good question. So we talk about 3 scopes of emissions. Scope 1 are the direct ones. So that can be, if somebody wants to jump in with an example, because my mind is going blank. Scope 2 is maybe I'll start just before somebody else jumps in. Scope 2 is around like the emissions from your electricity usage, for example. Scope 3 might be from like car fumes. Somebody want to jump in?
Scope 3, if you're, for instance, a fossil fuel producer, could be the emissions from burning the fossil fuels in another country.
Yeah, exactly. So Scope 3 tends to be the ones that you aren't directly causing, but you're kind of implicated in because you use the product or you're flying places or whatever it is. So it's kind of somebody else's direct emissions. So yeah, I guess that's kind of the point, is that scope 1 and 2, you can make very deliberate decisions about who your electricity provider is, for example, or how you manage your waste, or any of those kinds of things. Scope 1 is more of an issue for like producers of goods and goods mostly. It's kind of people who are releasing emissions through production services. Yeah, so I will stop there. If anybody else wants to jump in, please feel free. Oh, you're just on mute, Roslyn.
Sorry, did Jamie or Melanie, would you like to respond to that question about scope 3 emissions and the ACT? Oh, no. Okay, thanks very much. I hope that helped. And Annegret has also posted the report that talks about ACT scope 3 emissions, which I think we should all read. So thank you, Annegret. Another question that's slightly controversial that has come up from Jenny Goldie in Cooma is, when is stabilisation of population numbers going to be regarded as a legitimate mitigation tool? When is a steady state economy or even degrowth going to be the preferred economic model over economic growth? Would you like to respond to that one first, Kate, while you're on the screen?
I can. So can you just repeat one more time for me?
Sure. When is stabilisation of population numbers going to be regarded as a legitimate mitigation tool? When is a steady state economy or degrowth going to be the preferred economic model over economic growth?
Yeah, definitely controversial. Well, there's a lot of controversy around those questions.
Yes.
So I think the first thing I'd want to acknowledge is that population is obviously a factor that we look at, how many people there are of any country, but the main issue is emissions per capita. So it's not necessarily that we've got too many people, is that too many people are consuming too much. So I think questions around population, that isn't kind of the core question to be thinking about. Degrowth, again, not something I am as familiar with. So if Jamie or Mel want to jump in, but I suppose, again, it's controversial because I think our current economic model is so deeply ingrained in the concept of growth. But I think it's more around, or maybe kind of the middle kind of a bridge is looking at I saw somebody mention it, the circular economy. So how we define growth, I think there's scope to be looking at that. And I think asking questions around what resources do we have? What are the physical limits to these systems? And then how do we adjust the way that we work through, whether it's through efficiencies or recycling or stopping kind of unnecessary consumption to kind of bring back our activity within those limits. Mel or Jamie, is there anything you'd want to add?
I might just jump in there just to move to tie into that on degrowth. I think it is something that is coming up, I think, in literature, research and science, not necessarily degrowth, but looking at different factors of success. At the moment, our societies are very much about GDP as a measure of success, and growth is how we define our success. But there are calls now for actually re-evaluating that. The problem is to get that into mainstream, and I think that our capitalist system is probably still very prevalent. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I know that New Zealand has been talking about alternative measures of success and happiness in society. So there is, I think, movement going on, but definitely not something that's currently or penetrates really the overall discussion. On population growth, people describe it as the elephant in the room, and I think that is definitely true, and it doesn't really necessarily wants to be explicitly touched on, which is often the case in the climate change debate, that we don't really want to point out exactly what the problem is, just so we can continue talking about it. There are efforts though, and also in the Climate Change Convention or the Paris Agreement, of looking at empowerment of women, for example, or taking it this more into consideration. And there's research out there that shows that provision of contraceptives, for example, or provide access to family planning is something that would help reduce or slow down population growth, but definitely very sensitive topics that we might hear about more in the future. So very good question.
Thank you very much, Melanie. And perhaps if the next question harks back a little bit to Will Howard's question. And Russell Sully is asking, is wildfire regarded as a loss and damage impact of climate change as we see in Australia?
Does anyone want to start, even though it's a loss and damage question? Otherwise, I could just keep going. Jamie?
I would certainly say yes, when you see fires of the extent that we've had in the past few years, when we're looking at things like extinction of species, that's definitely loss and damage. When we're looking at changes to the way people live and use the landscape, then absolutely that's loss and damage. Certainly, when I go up into Kosciuszko National Park and it's just kilometres and kilometres of burnt landscape, even though with my biology training, I know that many of those things will grow back eventually, 100 years or so, if it's not burnt again. It pains me to see such a damaged landscape and know that the risk is that repeat fires will destroy that biodiversity, the aesthetics, the cultural value I get from the place. So yeah, absolutely fire is a contributor to loss and damage in its climate enhanced state.
Yeah, I agree with that, especially what we've seen here in Australia 2 years ago is caused, let's put it this way, a fire is not caused by climate change, but the bushfires that we had, the wildfires that we've seen are unprecedented, and because of climate change, made worse, and definitely a result of that and loss and damage. Yeah, so I agree with you, Jamie.
Thank you very much. While you're there, Melanie, our next top question is from Dorianne Erhart. And she has asked if you're aware of any intention by the Australian government to address loss and damage to the people of the Torres Strait.
So I am not aware of anything specifically that addresses problems or loss and damage that's caused within the Torres Strait. So my research was focused on small island developing states in the Pacific and the Caribbean. Yeah, so and it was very much global, so I'm not sure about anything specific there. I do know that Australia has been on the executive committee, for example, and has engaged in a lot of the actions that the WAS international mechanism advanced. So there was great involvement from Australia there. We do support our Pacific neighbours with something called the National Determined Contributions Hub. So there is assistance and capacity building there, but I'm not aware of something that is specific for the Torres Strait, I'm afraid. I'm sorry, Doreen.
Okay. Does anyone else know Jane? Oh, Jamie's.
We lost Jamie.
Lost Jamie?
We did.
We've lost Jamie. So quite sure. So he obviously won't be able to answer that question. So I will just see if we can, or maybe someone, Juliet can see if we can get Jamie back. In the meantime, there is a question. Let's try and find one that's not specifically for Jamie. That's Rachel. Hi. Back onto loss and damage. How are the ecological shifts such as invasive species taken into account in loss and damage? This is a question by Paul Leopardi.
I think that goes a little bit back into the question of the focus on humans rather than biodiversity. So I'm not an ecologist. Jamie would be probably a really good person to talk to you about that. But invasive species, it is very, I think it is something very specific. So if we're talking about one invasive species, I'm not sure whether we could then call that loss and damage. So it might be very context specific in that regard for loss and damage. But species extinction definitely falls under loss and damage. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So maybe we'll get Jamie back, and he would be able to talk to that a little bit in more detail.
Okay. So
I think there he is.
Oh, he's back. Okay.
Yes.
Perhaps I'll ask you all a question rather than go back to that one, which is one by Yamar Canal. I don't know if I've got that name right, but the question is, realistically, what is the likelihood that temperatures will be able to be limited to 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees? And I'd really like everyone to put some thought into answering that one, to give some people some hope, maybe. Kate, would you like to be the first one to respond to that one, given your talk?
Yeah, I can. It's a real battle, I think. I feel like anyone who works on climate would maybe say the same. You kind of, I think, need to hold some kind of optimism for the future. I think we can mobilize really quickly when we want to. And I think maybe that's the key point, is that at the moment, if we're looking at the gap, both the ambition and the implementation gap between what our current policies are, what we've said we'll do, and like the emissions pathway we're actually on, it feels like a really slim chance that we're going to be able to meet the 1.5 target. But at the same time, when we're looking at both Jamie and Mel's presentations, and we're listening to people in the Torres Strait, we're listening to people in the Pacific and Amazon, like all around the world, right? There is no room to go above 1.5. And I think if we keep talking about that as the hard reality, and I think we've seen a really, really strong shift over the last 12 to 18 months as more people are getting that message. 2 degrees isn't the kind of best we can do. And I feel like that was maybe where it was at when Paris was signed. 1.5 was really, really hard fought for from frontline communities, because they said this is the absolute limit. And I think what we've seen then is the gap between that being fought for tooth and nail by a small group of people, really bringing the mainstream along. And so I think my optimistic part is that momentum will continue to grow. I think the more people who come into the challenge and start looking at what it means for them, the more resources and ingenuity we've got behind us. So I think that the opportunity is really narrowing. We've got really not enough time, but I think if we put our heads together, we can do it.
Jamie, would you like to have a go at responding to that one?
Yeah, the trajectory we're on is clearly scary, but I tend to be a glass half full, and I think that eventually we're going to wake up as a society and get on top of climate change. And the optimist in me would argue that, it's looking like a propitious time in the next few years. And if that's the case, I'm hopeful that the adaptation measures that we take can retain so many of the things that we value in our society and landscape.
Yes. And Melanie, would you like to respond to that one as well?
Well, I'm glad that Kate and Jamie have such hopes, and really the glass is half full. I know that we can. We have all the technology. We have everything we need. I think a political will is missing. 1.5 is going to be tough. So I'm not sure whether I agree whether we can actually still make the 1.5. And regardless of whether we do, we've seen the losses and damages already caused by climate change, and that's not going away. And we've seen the amount of adaptation that is necessary, and that is also not going away. We haven't even attempted to adapt to everything that is out there. So I would really like to hope that we reach the 1.5, but we locked in so much damage already that it will be really hard for everyone to recover from that. And I'm not just talking about developing countries, but also about us. So yeah, let's keep the glass half full.
Okay, we're kind of running short of time, so we might have one more question and then move on to some final comments. So Gillian Reid has asked, do you see a role for private sector funding or only public sector when it comes to adaptation? Thinking of institutional investors such as super funds, insurers and uni endowments that have real estate, infrastructure, agriculture and private equity allocations. Perhaps, Jamie, would you like to be the first person to respond to this? But I'm happy to have responses from all the panel.
That's a great question, and I think the answer is yes. So in the past, I've been involved in trying to persuade governments to pull down old dams. And when it came to the engineering profession, the argument was there's equally as much excitement and funding and job satisfaction in pulling down an old dam as there was in building it in the first place. And I think when it comes to industry, the same could be true for adaptation, that there's a lot of really innovative and exciting things that need to be done. There's money to be made in terms of rebuilding our cities to be more climate adaptive, that will create better places for us to live and work. That's certainly the case in regional Australia, where there's so much potential for things like carbon sequestration money from the private sector to add to public funds to see large-scale restoration of landscapes, to involve Indigenous communities, to employ people in rural areas that have struggled to find regular work. And I think that, yes, good agriculture investment from those sorts of companies can be part of the solution.
Thank you very much. And Kate?
Yeah, I might just add to that. It's a great response. I think there's maybe two pieces to this. I think the first kind of is that there are mechanisms that investors can participate in adaptation, even though it's kind of not a natural fit in many ways. So governments, for example, can release green bonds that are designed to address adaptation needs. It's kind of, it's not a very high investment return, but it is a really great option. It is a part of many portfolios already. So that's kind of a way of working within the system. I think the other piece is acknowledging that a lot of companies have their own adaptation needs, and so will kind of as a matter of course be addressing them with financing from investors. But the big gap there, and this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, is that capital markets operate for kind of one or like for a set outcome, and public governments work in another. And I think there are lots of kind of common resources and spaces that aren't covered by companies, and we really need the government to be doing their job there. And so I think that again kind of goes to the need for some kind of a carbon price or levy to help fund that work that doesn't necessarily return a profit, but is really essential for people having the quality of life that we all deserve.
Thank you very much. And so I don't think we have time for more questions, but perhaps if each of you as panel members could reflect
Roslyn,
upon.
I was just thinking of whether I would be able to just add to that very
Sure.
quickly. Yeah.
Okay.
So
that could be your comment.
So I wanted to mention that in the loss and damage space, there are already insurance schemes identified, and there's insurance for loss and damage available. Whether that's enough or not is debatable, but it is definitely there. So the private sector has moved into that loss and damage space already, and there's definitely appetite for also private sectors and other companies and organizations to invest into adaptation or loss and damage, even if it doesn't have a positive net present value or return on investment, simply because they want to do the right thing. They lose their social license to operate if they don't. So there is increasingly action from the private sector as well, regardless of whether there is a direct profit or not. So, and we definitely have to tap into those sources as well, which is also, again, another mentioned under the UNFCCC, to source funding from all types of, all types of sources. So just to add to that.
Thanks very much. Melanie, I'm getting the we need to wind up kind of message. So thank you very much, speakers. I think all of you raised that there is a real issue here that we need to address. But there are options for addressing it, and we really need to grab those options and move with them. So thank you very much for giving us that hope. Thank you very much for those fantastic presentations. Thank you, audience, for attending. We really appreciated your questions and your comments throughout. And if you did have to leave early or you'd like to see this again, there's a recording of the whole event available tomorrow on the ICED's YouTube channel. Please remember to go and visit the Aquifer exhibition happening around Canberra, and a link to this is provided in the chat box. And also, just so you know, there's a 6-yearly report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change on climate impacts and adaptation options, which will be launched on the 28th of February. And ICEDS is hosting an event to discuss these findings in early March. So look out for that and hope you can attend that. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a nice evening.
Thank you. Thanks for having us, Roslyn, and to all the ICEDS people. It was great event.
Thank you, Melanie. Bye-bye.